All right. So again, once again, thank you so much all for joining us today for this webinar that's going to talk about CPACE financing and giving you really the basics and understanding of how this concept works, and then really what is going to be occurring moving forward with the program here in the state of New Mexico, and then how you can certainly avail yourselves to it in the future. So that's certainly what part of what we'll be touching on in today. And then Joanna, actually, I'll be turning it over to her in a moment to kind of just give more of an overview of what the presentation is about. And then we'll give some introductions of who the presenters will be today, which will include myself and another colleague of mine, which I'll introduce in a moment. And then we'll touch on very briefly just about my organization, which is the CPACE Alliance. And again, I'll discuss about that a little bit in more detail shortly. Then we'll go into talking about the actual overview of CPACE financing and how it works. And we'll give you some also CPACE case study examples to show you successful uses of this program. And basically then, how, again, this has been helpful for property owners to basically avail themselves to this financing in different states across the country. And then we'll just give you a quick sense about what the state of the program is currently here in New Mexico, so that you have awareness of that, and then what efforts actually that my firm of CPACE Alliance with our members actually just finished work with on an RFP contract that we had with them to basically help with thinking about how to modernize the program and make improvements to it so that it could be of better use to building owners here in the state of New Mexico. And then, of course, as time permits, we will then have a separate questions and answers a session here to allow you to ask any questions you might have as we went through the presentation today. And yes, and I'm hopeful that we just to keep these questions to the end so that we can just move through the content of the slides as quickly as we can so that we can leave you time to ask any questions you might have. All right, so I'm just going to briefly turn this over to Joanna Nelson from the Economic Development Department at the state of New Mexico, and she'll just provide you a quick sort of overview about what this presentation will go over today. All right, so over to you, Joanna.
Great, thanks, Nicholas. Hi, everyone, great to see you all. And feel free to put your organization and what community you're representing in the chat. Would love to see who all is in attendance today. I see a lot of names that I recognize, so great to see you in attendance. As Nicholas mentioned, my name is Joanna Nelson and with the Economic Development Department. And as long as I've been here, I have been focused on development finance and strategic planning. So CPACE has been on the radar as a development finance tool and as a solution for our companies that are interested in energy efficiency, retrofitting, etc. So we have been aware for quite some time that there are limitations with our current legislation around CPACE in our local governments. So we were excited and reminder microphone if you're not talking. Thank you. We are learning to use Zoom at EDD. We recognize set this up as a webinar, but if someone could help mute I'm not able to mute the participants. But CPACE has been on the radar, so we were really excited when Representative Nathan Small had appropriated funding to EDD to look into our current CPACE legislation and enable a contract, and that contract went to CPACE Alliance to be able to give us the framework and the recommendations on what a CPACE program could look like, as well as improvements that we can make to our New Mexico CPACE programming and legislation. So we're really thrilled to get the information and recommendations from this great group that's been compiled, and hopefully we can get some movement in the CPACE arena so this can be a development finance tool that our companies and our communities can use for economic development, community development, in alignment with all of the great things that it helps support that CPACE Alliance will go into. So I'll turn it back to you, Nicholas, and here via chat and available for questions, and I'll put my contact in the chat box if I can be of any assistance.
All right, great. Thank you so much for that introduction, Joanna. We appreciate that very much. All right, so let me now get into just quickly about who we are and who is going to be presenting to you this morning and on your end, certainly afternoon on my end here on the East Coast. But so my name is Nicholas Zuba. I'm Deputy Director at CPACE Alliance. CPACE Alliance, I'll go into a brief overview shortly, but just in short, we are a trade association that helps to represent different types of stakeholders within the CPACE industry. And that's namely CPACE capital provider firms and as well as law firms who are involved certainly in the structuring and transactions of CPACE, that when they're involved with that type of financing, they certainly, as law firms, get very involved with this. So those are certainly our main members in this case, and we're all just trying to work towards providing and developing a really sort of effective and as well as efficient form of financing in this case that can be provided in all the different states across the United States of America, to provide this financing as a great economic development and certainly an environmental type tool to help battle climate change that we know we're all dealing with at this point. And so, and then with that, my colleague, Jessa Coleman, I'm going to allow her a moment here to introduce herself. She will be certainly co-presenting with me today. Jessa?
Hi, it's great to see everyone, and I'll just echo Nicholas's and Joanna's comments. Thank you for joining us on this call. I'm the Associate Director of Policy and Programs at Naveen Green Capital. Naveen Green Capital is one of the leading CPACE capital providers in the country. And we are members of the CPACE Alliance and have been involved with the CPACE Alliance in working on CPACE in New Mexico for quite a while now. So looking forward to sharing more with you later in the presentation.
Great. Thank you so much, Jessa. All right. So let's launch into just talking about my organization in just a little bit more detail. So as I was beginning to mention is that, we are a coalition of different CPACE capital provider firms and as well as transaction experts, which again, among them include law firms, who we're committed to achieving the public benefits of CPACE through quantity and quality of these different CPACE financings. And the idea, of course, is the different kinds of activities and things that we do as an organization to help create this thriving and effective CPACE industry is first to drive capital investment through doing technical assistance to programs. So that included among the work that we just did here in New Mexico, and as well as to about at least a dozen other states across the United States of America to help with developing up brand new programs that included in different states, including like Washington State, Tennessee, and as well as a host of other different states across the country. And also helping to provide improvements to existing programs that exist around the country as well, with modernizing them and expanding them to include other ways that you can use CPACE financing on different types of development projects. We also do a lot of work in thought leadership with disseminating best practices of how basically different programs should be running in this case to get the best and most effective results of basically providing CPACE financing in those jurisdictions. And we also publish white papers on some particular topics. So we have published different papers on basically just general hallmark, the sort of hallmark best practices that should be in creating a CPACE program, and as well as on matters including lender consent, which I'll go into a little bit more detail as a part of program design a little later in this presentation. And so we are continuing to try and come up with developing those new ideas as we encounter new issues within the CPACE industry moving forward. And then lastly, we certainly develop and support different program administration models all across the country as well, because we definitely see value in different types of models in this case, whether it's basically a statewide administrator type model versus a county by county administration type models. There are different types that are out there, and certainly the conditions on the ground would warrant using specific types of those different types of administration models in order to get the most effective programs, basically getting the most out of those programs to do CPACE financing across the country. And of course, you see all the logos here. And of course, as I mentioned, Naveen Green Capital, of course, is one of our members, along with a host of other different types of capital providers and law firms who operate across the country. Okay, so with that said, let me now launch into talking more about CPACE as in a general concept in this case, so that you have a greater understanding of how this all works. So as I've mentioned, so CPACE, which stands for Commercial Property Assessed Clean Energy, this is an alternative form of financing that's available just for commercial property owners. So this excludes anybody who does residential type properties, whether it be single or two family type properties, or I'd say anything even up to about 4 units of residential in this case. They would not be the ones to get CPACE financing. Some examples of different properties in this case that can use CPACE financing that falls in this commercial bucket, it would be things like office buildings, retail, hospitality, so like hotels, and also looking at like warehouses and industrial type facilities, and as well as multifamily properties as well. And in this case, most programs across the country will have it where 5 units or greater is what would constitute a multifamily type property, in which case can get use of CPACE financing to help improve that building so tenants can reduce their energy consumption and those of the common areas within those buildings. And CPACE financing does cover a whole host of different types of project costs, both when we're talking about the retrofitting of existing buildings to make them more energy efficient from what the original design was, or for building a brand new building through new construction. Which then can all be related to basically helping to reduce energy consumption, water consumption in the building, and also generating renewable energy that building can work off of to be able then to be a more resilient and sustainable building in the future. And where CPACE is certainly, I think, a more nuanced but certainly, I think, a more advantageous form of financing in this case is that it's filling a gap in this case that traditional financing market is basically not maybe covering so much. Now, because with CPACE financing, what's unique about it, is, of course, is that it goes on the property as an assessment, kind of akin to other tax assessments like a water lien, a sewer lien, or any kind of other type of special district type assessments. It takes that very same character. And at the same time, it's also a longer term repayment option in this case that you can get maybe for terms of anywhere between, say, 20 and 30 years to repay on those particular improvements. Now, traditional financing and ordinary commercial loans, they would not normally have a term that will go out for 20 to 30 years on just a standard commercial project in this case. That's not a mortgage, for example. They will probably go out to like maybe 10 years at most. And if they were to offer then, say, the same kind of like lower financing rate in this case, they actually would not be comfortable to go out anything further than 10 years. They would actually then have to refinance maybe a customer in this case to order to get a longer term, but then maybe their interest rate will then go up in those outer years of a longer repayment term. Whereas with CPACE, it's a fixed interest rate that you'll be getting, and it typically is in there around the 5 to 6% range for CPACE financing that can be guaranteed to be given to a property owner over the course of that, say, 20 to 30 year period. And then they would repay it back over time, basically through their property tax collection mechanism is the most common way that that's done. And they work through their existing jurisdictions in this case to be able to go and do the repayment of that financing over the course of the life of that loan that they'll be repaying back on the property. And in terms of where CPACE is currently available, it's currently available in about 30 states across the country. You can see on this map, the blue colored states in this case are those states that are currently active and have already closed on CPACE projects across the country. In the green states, those are states where they have a program that has been activated in this case, and there's a statute in place to develop that program, but there is still no closed project yet in those states. Some of the most recent entrants into the CPACE industry has included states like Hawaii, Tennessee, Washington State, as I've mentioned, and as well as some host of other states in this case that we've been working on in the industry to help bring CPACE to all the different states across the country in this case. And of course, CPACE has been, been around for probably well over a decade at this point, and we've seen at least about $2.5 billion worth of CPACE activity across the country, and well over 2,000 projects have been done all across the country. And so just beginning to show you that there is certainly very positive and certainly a very good track record in this case of CPACE all across the country and doing a lot of these great projects to help reduce their energy consumption, and then therefore their greenhouse gas emissions all across the country. And so we're hopeful that someday all 50 states, in this case, will have this enabled and available to be able then to go and do these very key and critical projects for our society. So what is typically funded by CPACE? So as I mentioned in the outset, we were talking about the traditional types of projects of like energy efficiency, water conservation, and as well as renewable energy projects, right? So for example, on like the energy efficiency side, you might be looking at improvements that could be helping to reduce your energy consumption for heating and cooling of a building, so HVAC equipment. Changing out lighting in this case that's older, say like fluorescent type lighting, and then maybe going towards LEDs as a way to help to reduce the amount of lighting energy consumption that a building might have. That could also be an approved type of improvement to do on a property. The envelope of the building, right? So how well that the building is sealed, and the envelope in this case, that what that's referring to is basically just how well does it keep in that heat and that cool air in this case that the building's trying to generate during the appropriate times of year, and to be able to be sure that that does not get leaked out when you're basically trying to keep that space comfortable for occupants. Then in terms of then also to with regards to at least envelope, is part of it is certainly then like the roofing and insulation, because certainly the better the insulation, the better you're able to keep the air that you're trying to heat or cool in that building to be able to keep that in this case, so that you can have that more comfortable and occupied space for anybody who comes into there. Certainly elevators too can be a way to help reduce energy consumption if you're talking about like an energy efficiency type project. The motors and other sort of devices in this case within that elevator can take up a lot of energy. It can use a lot of energy. And so that has also been something we've seen done with using CPACE in the past. Then in terms of water conservation, so anything with regard to water reuse, so basically doing the recycling of water inside of the building, replacement of water fixtures to help with maybe having a flow be a little lower in this case, so that then there's not much waters per gallon, gallons per minute that's coming out of those fixtures. Irrigation is another great way of helping to reduce on energy on water consumption in this case. You may put in specific meters in this case that can sense and read if there's any kind of rain in the area. Because if they can sense that there's rain falling, then it wouldn't be having to have to irrigate and to water plants. Maybe they're on that same commercial property. And then in terms of, say, renewable energy sources, things like cogeneration, which can basically help to provide both heating and as well as electricity at the same time in the very same unit. And usually natural gas is typically the input energy use, in terms of the actual energy input that would be helping to produce both that electricity and as well as then say the heat that would come off of that unit that basically is a byproduct of the electricity that's created. And certainly solar systems, which again is looking more lucrative to actually finance and actually to deploy nowadays, especially with the passage of the Federal Inflation Reduction Act, which I believe is going to extend the investment tax credit at the 26% level for at least the next decade. So it's going to be certainly more advantageous to be deploying solar now than probably it ever has been, certainly in our country's history. So definitely that's where now CPACE can really then also come in and be very helpful for deploying those projects alongside of these more lucrative federal tax incentives that we're going to be seeing. And then another area that we've been seeing CPACE financings expand into is known as resiliency. So resiliency is acting to make a building certainly better protected against certain natural disasters and other kinds of occurrences that would actually damage that building and prevent it from being occupied if it ever were to sustain serious damage as a result of, say, a hurricane, tornadoes, floods, any of those kinds of natural occurrences that we've been seeing. So also one of the ways that also to resiliency has been helpful is helping to protect the building that's located in a seismic area. So knowing to have be vulnerable and prone to earthquakes. And in this area, especially in the Southwest and around, say, California, in sort of Nevada as well, they've seen different types of earthquakes in this case that have affected their areas. So shoring up a building so that it's better protected against an earthquake is certainly one way now that we've seen CPACE also been used in different states across the country. And then certainly with like windstorms, so helping to harden a building so that it's better protected against higher winds, say from a hurricane or from any other types of natural occurrences like a tornado, so that basically it can withstand that pressure of those particular wind events in this case, so that the building can remain standing in this case, and then not sustaining enough damage that it can't be occupied any longer. So that's just a sense of really, again, how far and wide CPACE has become, starting from the days of when it was in energy efficiency and doing renewable energy projects. It has now really been growing and expanding now to doing more of these water conservation and resiliency type improvements as well. So CPACE continues to evolve, and it's beginning to expand into many different other areas of making a commercial property certainly more sustainable and resilient. Now, CPACE, as I've mentioned, has been pretty popular. We've done well over $2.5 billion worth of activity and over 2,000 projects nationwide. Now, among the reasons why it's been so popular and has been widely adopted is because, number one, for retrofit projects, typically you can get 100% of the cost of those improvements to be funded through CPACE, and that there would be no out-of-pocket expense that a property owner has to pony up for doing those particular projects. So CPACE, yes, normally does not have any kind of owner equity requirements that they have to contribute certain amounts of their own funds in order to be able to get CPACE financing. So this now at least allows them to have now the flexibility to get as much financing as possible and do as deep of a retrofit as they can do on the building, so they're maximizing the amount of savings they can get for reducing the amount of energy consumption that they're going to be seeking to do through those projects. Next, then certainly on new construction, we typically will see these projects be able to give about 15 to 25% of the total project cost for developing out basically a capital stack to develop a brand new building. And I'll touch on that actually in a little bit, of really what the benefit of adding CPACE in a new construction capital stack is going to look like in terms of saving the borrower on their debt service payments that they're making over time across all the different forms of debt that would be put into the capital stack for a development project. But this is actually very important and key on actually making development projects certainly more sustainable, but also too ensuring that that development project can go forward now. Because it would be more attractive financing that's at a lower interest rate that certainly a developer would want to take out and take advantage of. So it's also, as I mentioned, there's this, really no sort of, guarantees that have to be provided by that property owner, and that's why it's considered a non-recourse form of financing in this case. So that just emphasizes that point where basically no property owners guarantees have to be provided or to provide any kind of funding of their own in order for a project to move forward. It's also a non-accelerating form of financing because, as I mentioned, this is an assessment that would then get placed and levied onto the improved property. And in the way that, of course, that it's billed, it will be billed just at the very same schedule that a local jurisdiction's tax collection cycle would be. So if the property owner fails to make a payment of any kind and that they're delinquent then on making the CPACE payment, whatever then can be, the only portion of that can be foreclosed upon is not then the entire balance of the CPACE loan, but just what has been billed but not been collected yet by that property owner. So the idea then with this is that it just will then continue to then exist on the property, that financing in this case, say that if a foreclosure sale has to happen, that new property owner will simply take on the remaining payments that will be occurring in the future to be billed by that tax collector to the property owner, because again, it does not get extinguished either. After basically that foreclosure process, because again, it does not get taken out in the midst of a foreclosure process. So just only what is delinquent was ever going to be called forward to be able to have to be paid back through a foreclosure process. It is not then the full amount of the CPACE financing. What's also in terms of beneficial to the property owner in this case and making their payments is that it increases their cash flow, and as well as their net operating income and as well as the asset value. Now, it increases their cash flow, certainly, even say as they are paying back on their CPACE obligation over time, is because now they're going to be getting that extra energy savings now from doing their project, especially for a retrofit in the building, or certainly for the first-time occupants and as well as operators of a brand new building, who's going to be now getting a lower cost of operation for that building because now they're not paying as much on their energy bills. They also not maybe have to pay as much anymore on, say, operation and maintenance expenses, right? To basically upkeep existing equipment in the building that might have been breaking down often in the past. Now those expenses will go away for the most part while they have this brand new equipment. And certainly then that will lead to then a net operating income that's going to be much higher than for the property owner. And the reason why we say it increases the asset's value in this case is because it has been shown that if you do these kinds of energy saving improvements, it tends to be considered to be those capital type improvements. And capital improvements can certainly then increase the appraised value of a property if you show and demonstrate that you've made that investment into the property. And so that tends to then show a certainly appreciable increase in the value of that property because you've made those key capital investments to help improve the energy efficiency and even to the resiliency of that particular property. And so that is too something that can be of advantage to a property owner as they do these particular projects. And as I mentioned as well before, that there are fixed interest rates associated with CPACE. There's no typically any kind of floating or variable rates associated with this financing. So at least they have a good sense to know about what their debt obligation is and what the debt service that they're repaying over time. Because these interest rates will again be the same all throughout the repayment of their CPACE obligation, which typically we see is again over a 20 to 30 year period. And typically, these particular financing, in terms of the term that they get, it normally can't exceed the useful life of the improvements. So the idea then is that you want to be sure that the savings that they're getting from doing these improvements will in fact go and be able then to pay back on the CPACE obligation over time, that they can show and demonstrate that this is projects that will repay for themselves, and that they don't want then the financing to go out beyond the useful life of those improvements, because then they may not see as much of savings in this case coming back in this case for those from doing those improvements over time. And then certainly as the property is sold to a future property owner, again, the beauty of this is that the CPACE obligation then does not come with the property owner who took it out, because again, it's an obligation that stays with the property itself. So it then transfers to a brand new property owner, and that they would be notified of knowing that there's a CPACE obligation on the property, and then the programs will take the appropriate course of treating that so that they can do the proper transfer and handoff of the CPACE obligation, in this case, to whoever the new property owner becomes. And I think there's been several examples of where the property owners who will take over a property are willingly accepting the new obligation in this case and be able to continue paying it as they are the property owner of the property. So there has been I've not seen many examples really where, say, a property owner refuses to take on the new obligation in the time that they're going to own the property. All right, so then just really quickly, in terms of how then CPACE financing works and what are sort of key elements that are important to a CPACE project. So first and foremost, it's defining what your project opportunity is and what the elements are that are eligible for CPACE financing. So a property owner, say if they're retrofitting an existing building, they'll work with a contractor or some project developer who will help them with figuring out, what are the good opportunities for the building through doing what's known as an energy audit, typically on the building, in which case that contractor or project developer will go through the building and look for those particular opportunities with the property owner. And then they will then develop up a scope of work. And then they'll see, again, if any and all those elements are in fact eligible for CPACE financing. And so they can then work directly with the program thereafter to figure out what exactly can be financed in that particular scope of work. And then, they will work with then between the property owner and a capital provider will be to then create terms in this case that can be negotiated to figure out what is, again, the best type of CPACE financing that fits for that project. Because as I mentioned, the term really should not go out, I think, anything further than what the useful life of those improvements are. That's typically what most programs will do. And so typically they'll size up those terms so that it makes sense for the property owner and the type of project that they're doing. And as I've mentioned, the term usually can be anywhere from 20 to 30 years in terms of length of repayment. And then usually the interest rate is somewhere in the range of like around the 5 to 6% is typically what we see in different financings across the country. And as I've mentioned, there's basically then an independent energy analysis that's typically done on these projects to, again, bear out what is the utility cost savings and if these projects are considered to be cost effective. because there are some programs across the country that still have a concept which is known as a savings to investment ratio or a cost benefit ratio type analysis to determine that are there enough savings to help cover the cost of doing that particular project when they're paying back on their CPACE financing. And so that particular independent analysis would have to be done to ensure that there is savings demonstrated and that it maybe is in fact meeting those particular SIR or CBR type tests. And of course, as I mentioned before, and I'll say again, is that the bills and collection for this is done like in a manner of property taxes, and those payments are made back to basically tax collectors typically within their local jurisdictions. To be able then to continue doing what they have to do in terms of the payment over time. And of course, if basically then it comes to the point where they do become delinquent, as mentioned, it is enforced in the very same manner as property taxes, even though it's not in itself a property tax. It's just merely a tax assessment that typically goes on the property, and that would then get enforced in that very same manner. So let me give you an example in this case of how this works within a capital stack of a project. So on the left, you'll see that an example of this $50 million sort of office redevelopment project. So you have in this case, three forms of funding in this case that's coming in here. Two are debt in nature. So one's basically like the senior mortgage debt that's accounting for about $27.5 million of the project. Then you have basically what's known as mezzanine type debt, which is probably a very more expensive form of debt in this case, and that's accounting for about $12.5 million of this project. And then the owner actually is coming out of pocket with their own equity for the rest of the $10 million of that project. But you'll see, of course, all of these three different types of funding that's in this capital stack, it's working out to a weighted average cost of capital, that's what WACC stands for, of close to 9% across all those different forms of funding. So that's a pretty expensive capital stack in this case that this developer, in fact, is going to be paying back over time. But then let's then shift to the right column in this case and then look at it when CPACE is actually put into the project. So what now CPACE is actually doing in this case, it's helping to displace the need for that more expensive form of mezzanine debt that you saw in the first example. So CPACE financing is taking $10 million of that $12.5 million that mezzanine debt was originally covering, and now it's only reducing the amount of mezzanine debt down to $2.5 million. So now with adding in that $10 million of PACE financing at about a 6.75% interest rate that we're demonstrating in this example, that's lowering the WACC in this case on this particular project capital stack by over 1% now. So now it's down to 7.9% for them to basically pay back on all these forms of debt. And so this is not only in this case helping with filling out a capital stack, but it's clearly the benefit here is that you're making it less costly for a property owner to have to go repay on their financing now over time. And so now they're standing to see a whole percentage of savings there that they're going to be able to save now, and they don't have to now repay on the debt service of that interest payments that have to be made for the CPACE financing, as well as these other forms of financing that they have to pay as well. So that's just one sort of demonstration really of how beneficial CPACE can now be when you basically are including this in a particular project that you might be wanting to work on. And then so in terms of one of the last points here about CPACE is that there's a common sort of guardrail that we've put into all the different programs across the country, and what's known as lender consent. So lender consent is basically a way for us to get an additional set of eyes on a particular transaction, because we know that with these CPACE transactions, there's always multiple sets of stakeholders who are looking at this project, whether it be the CPACE capital provider themselves. There are lawyers who typically look at these projects, and then certainly now with adding in this requirement of lender consent, now you're getting the senior mortgage lenders involved with this particular project as well, to get their okay and their own underwriting of that project, because now we're creating all these different sets of guardrails that basically can ensure that it's something that the property owner should feel comfortable with financing in this case, because all the major relevant parties have really looked at these transactions with clear-eyed and very detailed in terms of how they're looking at this. And so basically, the reason why then lender consent then is put in here and why the mortgage lender should do it is that CPACE basically projects make the building and certainly that lender's collateral more valuable in this case, because again, we're ensuring that, there's that guardrail in place and that the lender is particularly careful, and then they're comfortable with knowing that there's another set of financing that's going on their property, and that now in this case to sure that it's a pretty secure property, and so that's going to make that certainly a more valuable one, certainly to the lender's own collateral that they're going to keep on the property as security. And again, only delinquency-based installments are senior to the mortgage at any given time. And yeah, that's the other thing I forgot to mention, is that certainly then CPACE, which is acting as a tax assessment, it does go in front of the mortgage lender in this case. But again, as I've mentioned, with this not being this is a non-accelerating form of financing, so therefore all the future installments don't accelerate under, say, a foreclosure. And that's not all what's coming in front of a mortgage then in this case, in terms of that waterfall that will happen in terms of paying off any sort of those outstanding debt obligations. So it's only just what's been billed, but simply had not been collected from the property owner. And again, as we've mentioned, that the energy savings does offset the CPACE loan cost, that it helps to repay back on that obligation over time, and that the terms of the financing are structured in such a way to ensure that it's really then the savings is going to cover for those particular project improvements, because we don't want that to exceed the useful life of the improvements. And as of course we've mentioned that this does improve upon cash flows and improves the owner's ability to pay their own debt as they repay that CPACE obligation over time. All right, so that pretty much is the overview of how basically CPACE works and how this whole debt obligation has been helpful certainly to different stakeholders. Now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Jessa, and she's going to take you through some case study examples of how CPACE has worked in other states. Jessa?
Great, thank you so much. So let's just jump to the first one. So I'm going to show you a number of case studies quite briefly, all things considered. I think that probably the most impactful explanation of how CPACE works was really covered through that graphic that Nicholas shared with you that showed two capital stacks for funding an energy efficiency project, one including PACE and one not. But these are all examples that are about to follow of real life projects across the country that have been funded using CPACE financing. So this first example is from Colorado. And in this example, a gentleman named James Clark and his co-founder decided to install a new HVAC system, energy efficiency lighting, solar installation on their roof, as well as a roof to support that solar installation, and electric vehicle charging stations. They used almost $300,000 of CPACE financing to fund these improvements. So this was certainly a smaller CPACE project. The asset value, that is the underlying building that was retrofitted in this instance, increased about $165,000, with the lifetime energy savings resulting from this project being almost $300,000. And this project, which was $300,000, is being repaid right now over a 15-year term. I think most notably, we do have some environmental statistics on this project. This project, over the lifetime of the measures that were financed using CPACE, are expected to reduce GHG emissions by 1,869 tons as compared to what the building would have emitted had these improvements not been installed. So this is, I think, a good example of how a small office building might use CPACE to install necessary improvements such as an HVAC system, and to cut down on its utility bills through the installation of solar panels on the roof. So next slide, please. Right. This is another smaller project, one that was actually funded by my firm. The total project cost here was only $135,000, repaid over 20 years. And in this situation, the expected energy savings resulting from the measures that were funded exceeds the total project cost. So expected lifetime savings are $175,000 off of the utility bills, essentially. And what that means is that this is an example of a project that was actually cash flow positive for the borrower from day one, right? So because PACE financing does not require any money down on behalf of the borrower, and because the utility expenses were expected to decrease in a manner that exceeded the actual cost of the improvements, this was a situation where the borrower did not have to use any of their own funds and actually came out ahead in this situation from a financial perspective. These were the Hatchery Road apartments, a small apartment building in the Waterford Township in Michigan. And they used CPACE financing to install LED lighting throughout the property, new furnaces and air conditioning systems, building insulation. That's one thing that's included in like building envelope improvements that are eligible for financing. Low flow toilets and shower heads and other water fixtures. So they were able to get a lot of bang for their buck in this situation. All right, next slide, please. Now, this case study represents, in one sense, the other end of the spectrum, although this is still, all things considered, a relatively small PACE project at this point in the market development. This was a Comfort Inn in Missouri that used PACE financing to fund lighting, HVAC, windows, insulation, and hot water efficiency improvements. This building owner used over $1 million of CPACE financing to be repaid over a 20-year period. The improvements from this financing resulted in lifetime energy savings of $1.3 million and annual energy savings of about 358,000 kilowatt hours. This is a very, very standard example of a sort of mid-level hotel using CPACE financing. Hotels make up a large portion of the CPACE portfolio nationwide, hotels and office buildings in particular. Although, as Nicholas shared earlier, CPACE financing can be accessed by a broad range of building owners. Like I said, this is sort of the other end of the spectrum. So the first two projects were small projects under $200,000. This is an example of a project that was $1 million. Could you jump to the next slide, Nicholas? And this is an example of a project that is, again, only about $100,000. Now, I think we actually don't have an example on this particular presentation, but a lot of CPACE projects that are being closed today are in the realm of $10 to $20 million. The market is definitely evolved and is maturing. The examples that we're showing you are sort of classical CPACE case studies where small business owners are using PACE to retrofit existing buildings. These larger projects that are in the multi-millions are typically those where CPACE is being used as a component of the capital stack for constructing a new building from the ground up. Again, sort of pointing back to that example slide that Nicholas shared earlier. Of sort of the varying WACC or weighted average cost of capital between a project, a large development that uses CPACE financing to fund a portion of that project versus one that does not. But here we've got a small building owner, a general store in Texas. This project was actually funded by the Frontier Bank of Texas. You know, one thing I don't think we've talked about too much is who funds these projects. You know, I work for, again, Naveen Green Capital. We're a subsidiary of TIAA. So we are a subsidiary of one of the largest institutional investors in the world. So that gives you an example of one type of capital provider, but we're certainly not the only. There are a number of specialty CPACE capital providers that operate in this market, but any capital provider is able to provide this type of financing who wishes to, whether that's a Main Street bank, a large traditional commercial bank, such as a Bank of America, or a specialty CDFI. So there are a number of different actors that can offer this financing, which really results in an open, competitive market for borrowers who wish to access CPACE financing, ensuring that they're achieving the best rates and terms available to them. So this project resulted in an expected electric utility use reduction of 26%. Avoided annual CO2 is almost 50 tons. This was, and again, on quite a small building, only 15,776 square feet. And this project is being repaid over the course of 10 years. So next slide, please. All right, so this is the final portion of our presentation, and then we're going to open it up to questions, but we want to give you an overview of where is CPACE in New Mexico, right? Why are we giving this presentation today? So the New Mexico legislature was actually one of the earliest states in the country to pass CPACE legislation, enabling legislation at the state level. You do need to pass state level legislation in order to provide for CPACE financing in any given state. You do also have to pass local level legislation, though that's getting a bit into the weeds. The point is, New Mexico was one of the first states that comes with pros and with cons, right? The pro is that they got to be, the state was a bit of a market leader. The con is that there are a lot of best practices that we know now in the PACE industry writ large that weren't implemented when the PACE legislation in New Mexico was originally passed, because we just hadn't gained the decade plus of experience that we have now as an industry. So there were two separate bills actually that were passed and enacted in 2009, both of which were designed to enable PACE programs, though the legislation itself really looks nothing like the legislation that we see enabling PACE financing today. So there are programs right now that have been established in the city of Albuquerque and in Bernalillo County, but to our knowledge, no CPACE projects have yet been closed in either of those areas, and there are not programs, available elsewhere in the state. Now, the reason for that goes back to, again, what I was just saying about sort of establishing best practices, right? There are certain things that the market, financial markets, require in terms of how a CPACE program is legally structured, which is not provided for in the existing legislation, and which has prohibited investment in these programs and in New Mexico. So to that effect, in 2022, the New Mexico Economic Development Department commissioned an RFP to seek technical assistance on redeveloping the CPACE program. So analyzing where is the program at today, and why hasn't it closed any deals yet? You know, what are the technical fixes that are required in order to get this program really moving and grooving in the way it is in New Mexico's neighbors So the CPACE Alliance, as mentioned, was awarded the contract to provide recommendations on how to improve the state's enabling legislation. We have already at the CPACE Alliance fulfilled the requirements of this RFP and submitted our recommendations to the Economic Development Department. So if we can jump to the next slide, just to provide a very brief summary of what those recommendations are. First, we recommended expanding the eligible improvements authorized under the state statute. The existing state statutes authorize CPACE financing to fund only renewable energy improvements, with a particular emphasis on solar generation. That is a very limited applicability of CPACE financing. Everywhere else in the country, CPACE financing is used to fund all sorts of energy efficiency related improvements like we've seen through the prior case studies. It's also in recent years been authorized in several states to fund resiliency related improvements, such as Nicholas described earlier on the call. And even recently, particularly in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, in some limited jurisdictions, it's been used to, it has been authorized for use to make buildings more healthy and to have better air quality for their inhabitants or for their tenants or office goers. So that was our first major recommendation. We also provided recommendations around the lending model. The existing legislation requires sort of two things. One of the statutes requires bonding, a bonding model for CPACE financing, which was more common back in 2009, but has effectively been rejected across the country today. And it also requires local treasurers to bill, collect, and enforce the CPACE assessments. Now, we have worked with stakeholders in New Mexico, as well as with the Economic Development Department, to identify a legal mechanism that would allow the program to outsource billing, collection, and enforcement of delinquent assessments directly to the capital providers, which is much more attractive to local governments as it removes some of the burden of administering this program from them. So that's one of our recommendations, and our recommendations also include removing that bonding requirement, as the market has demonstrated that it's simply not necessary. It's much more financially efficient for capital providers to lend directly to eligible projects. We also recommend that the statute require senior mortgage lender consent before any CPACE assessment is levied on a property. And we also recommend that a sort of minimum standard set of program guidelines be developed and adopted across the state in order to facilitate an efficient uptake of CPACE financing across New Mexico. One thing that would be a detriment to the program would be if every single county in New Mexico adopted different guidelines with different application processes and property eligibility requirements. That would add a lot of additional sort of cost in terms of legal review and really just staff resource effort to understand sort of a fragmented market like that. Again, what we've seen across the country is that the most efficient PACE programs, the most efficient markets are those that are standardized across an entire state. And that's where we see the highest level of investment. So those are the recommendations generally that we have provided to the Economic Development Department of New Mexico. And it is now up to Joanna and her team to determine in what way they wish to implement these recommendations. One thing that it would require at some point would be an amendment of the existing state statute, either in the coming legislative session or in another legislative session. So there's still a bit of work to be done in New Mexico before CPACE financing can be available, but we wanted to provide this introduction to CPACE financing and this webinar on where things stand in order to sort of raise awareness about the program and to confirm that there's a real interest here in New Mexico to, fix the statute, for lack of a better word, and to really roll out this program and make it available on a broad-based basis throughout the state to New Mexico's property owners, contractors, financial institutions, etc. So with that, I'd like to thank you again for joining us today and open the floor to any questions.
All right, so I think the way we'll handle this is that if anybody had sent in any of their questions via chat, I'm going to go through those first. And then certainly if anybody here who has a particular question that they had for either Jessa or myself or Joanna in this case, then please unmute yourself and then you can go ahead and ask your question at that point. So let me start first with the one question we have received in the chat, which was basically just asking about, whether or not, CPACE financing is available for anybody other than just businesses in this case. Does it also include, public or governmental entities of any kind? Yeah, normally in this case, CPACE financing is really, I think, meant for private and as well as nonprofit type properties in this case, but not any of those in the public sector though. It's because I think the really main reason for that being is that again, because the nature of CPACE being a property assessment in this case that goes on the property, and you have to then the right then to foreclose on that particular property to then reclaim any delinquent payments that are made. What happens now is that you'll then be able to foreclose on a public-owned property, which again, they're not going to be very interested in seeing happen to them. So I think that just becomes more of a challenge in this case to be able to work with those particular public type owned properties in this case, and that's why it's meant maybe largely just for these sort of private and nonprofit type owned buildings. And then just looking at another question that came into here in the chat is saying, how is this different from our rural efficient business program other than the rural focus? I'm not versed on that. So Joanna, would you happen to have any kind of expertise on this?
Sure, and thanks for the question, Sandy. Our rural efficient business program is an we might need to mute some folks if you're not talking. Thanks for your patience with the muting. EDD has a program called the Rural Efficient Business Program, and it is independent to our department where we support our businesses that are interested in energy efficiency. So it's more of connections and providing a network of resources that we are making for our rural businesses that want to do projects around energy, reducing their energy consumption, increasing energy efficiency, and looking at renewable energy systems. And the CPACE is an actual development finance tool that could be applied. So it's the perfect fit and complement to Rural Efficient Business Program, because if a company is wanting to engage in a project around energy efficiency or any of the number of uses that Nicholas and Jessa mentioned, CPACE perhaps could be a really good tool for that. And I believe Felicia DePaula is on. She's the program manager. Felicia, maybe if you want to put the website and your contact in the chat for folks that aren't aware of the program, we can give you some more information about it.
Perfect. I'll add that now.
All right, that's great. All right, so then one other question that just came in through the chat is saying that will there be opportunities for local banks to participate as lenders? So again, that's probably a question, I think, more for what New Mexico is going to decide to do. But I can tell you that there certainly has been precedent that local banks and sort of regional type lenders have actually become their own CPACE lenders in this case in the market. Some case examples of this could be in states like Minnesota, which has had a very successful track record of basically doing those different types of projects with local lenders. In Colorado, they've also done the same thing too, being very successful in working with local lenders. So definitely there's that precedent, and certainly this is something I think that could be done as long as this then becomes a direct lending type model, and that basically any kind of capital provider can be qualified to basically provide the CPACE financing in that jurisdiction. So I would think that with a direct lending model, it definitely could open up that possibility. All right, so those are all the questions that were in the chat. Did anybody else have any questions? If they wanted to go ahead and unmute yourself, you may do so at this time.
I have one question. I know you guys mentioned the suggestions are under review by the EDD, but is there a more or less expected date for when the program would be reopened?
I think that's the best question for Joanna. Although I will say that from the capital provider perspective, no capital provider will be able to lend in New Mexico until the state legislation is amended to, at minimum, address sort of some of the sort of structural deficiencies that we've identified. So the earliest that any program could be available would be after this next year's New Mexico legislative session, if legislation were to be proffered during that session.
Okay.
But definitely an excellent question, and it's certainly, I think, a burning one for certainly all key stakeholders.
This is Robert Stetson, Casas de Sueños Historic Inn in Albuquerque. What I'm kind of interested in, because I think this is all such a great presentation, and thank you. I'm wondering what the current status Investment Act was House Bill 299, which seemed to answer a lot of the questions or do a lot of what you're talking about, repealing the solar energy aspect of this and getting it back online. Is anyone working at interim committee to get prepared for getting this passed in a 6-day session?
Hi there, this is Joanna from EDD. And I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name. Can you repeat your name?
Sure, Robert Stetson.
Mr. Stetson, okay. Thank you for the question. I noticed that Glenn Schiffbauer is on, who is the CEO of the Green Chamber in Santa Fe. Maybe Glenn has some insight. We have been working with Representative Nathan Small on this project. He was the one that allocated junior money to fund this initiative. And outside of that effort, I am not privy to any activity. So maybe if anyone knows, they could share it in the chat, or Glenn, feel free to chime in. And we can follow up, Mr. Stetson, if you want to put your email in the chat, and I can poke around and see if I can find any leads there.
Yeah, this is Glenn. I think that Representative Small's bill is still incubating to some extent. One of the things that we worked on in this past session was to prevent counties who were trying to get rid of CPACE and the PACE bills, because there wasn't any uptake, and they didn't want to, and this was particularly Bernalillo and Doña Ana, they didn't want to commit the resources to having to administer to those particular things. And so that bill was defeated. So we still do have the opportunity to make it a viable option in counties. But again, as Jessa was talking about earlier, we do need some state codification in order for the states or for the counties to really get on board and to be able to administer this on people's property tax. So hopefully there'll be some action on that this upcoming session. I've not seen anything in the interim committee so far.
Well, great. Thank you so much, Glenn, for that answer. I think that that's helpful. Any other questions?
Hi, yes, this is Irene Barra from the City of Las Cruces Economic Development Department. And I was just hoping you could elaborate when you said that the Doña Ana County didn't want to commit resources. I was just curious if you could provide a little bit more information about that.
Yeah, that was me. This is Glenn with the Santa Fe Green Chamber of Commerce. The CPACE is on the books, as Jessa mentioned, and there were two counties, Doña Ana, the county clerk there, and also at Bernalillo, that were lobbying this past session to have it removed from the books. And the question always arose, well, if nobody is using it, why not leave it? And I think that that's how the vote came down, to leave it on the books. And hopefully we can use these kinds of sessions and economic development at the state level to push and get more of this momentum going so that we can actually use it. Because I know that going through the water conservation, commercial water conservation programs that we've established here in Santa Fe, that are not so much our restaurants, but our hotels would, I think, be clamoring for the ability to finance even just, as you mentioned before, water conservation measures and toilets and aerators that they could finance over a long period of time. I think that would take some of the resistance in some of their conservation matters. But yeah, there were some county clerks that were not really looking forward to being able to or having to take on CPACE at that county clerk level.
Yeah, I can add a little bit of additional color there as well. And apologies, Glenn, it sounds like you and I should have met one another by now, but maybe you met my colleague, Genevieve Sherman. But our firm also worked very, very closely on House Bill 299 with Representative Small last year. And we had a number of small group and one-on-one conversations with county elected officials, particularly county treasurers, about their concerns. The main concern that we were told, at least, was primarily around county resources being used to bill, collect, and enforce these assessments. That is because CPACE is legally a special tax assessment, and that legal status is critical to the financial mechanism working. In most other states in the country, the assessments are billed and collected and enforced in case of delinquency by the local county treasurer or finance office. Even though the funds are initially provided by a private capital provider, right? So just to be super clear, the way it would work for example, is at Naveen Green Capital, we might provide $1 million of our own funds to Glenn, who wants to replace his HVAC and install solar and LED lighting on his organization's building. Fine. So we're going to provide $1 million of our own private money to fund this. We're going to sign a private loan agreement with him and his organization. But there is going to be a corresponding $1 million special CPACE tax assessment that gets placed on the property and is actually recorded in the land records, right? Just like any other assessment or a property secured debt like a mortgage. And in most other places in the country, that assessment would be billed and collected by the county treasurer. And the funds that were collected each year would actually be remitted to the initial capital provider. So my firm or, you know, another firm that might hold the lien on the assessment. In New Mexico, the county treasurers were particularly concerned about being required to take on that responsibility. This is not the first time we've heard that concern. It's become a more common concern, particularly in states that have a number of more rural counties where they don't have a lot of local resources to administer any sort of public programs. So even though no public funds were being used directly to finance the CPACE assessment, there was still concern over just pure staff time and having the internal staff resources to do this, which is why in our recent research at the CPACE Alliance, we worked with a local law firm, Wade from that law firm, which is called Sutton, Thayer and Brown. Wade Jackson is also on this call. And we worked with that law firm to identify a legal mechanism by which the billing, collection, and enforcement could be outsourced to a third party, while we, the capital providers, would still feel that we held the sort of legal security that we need in this assessment to be able to offer the loan and the terms that we offer on this type of financing. So the good news is that a solution that hopefully will please everyone has been identified, but that still needs to be implemented in a future law.
Thank you, Jess. I did mean county treasurer, not county clerk.
Oh, no problem.
Thank you. No, that's perfect.
I have another question if we have time.
Yeah, please go ahead.
So like I put it in the chat, we're a small company in Los Alamos, New Mexico. We are developing a solar window product for specifically targeted to commercial buildings. I'm wondering, is there a sad process company with like ours with a new product can go through to be I don't know if this would be the right word, but like CPACE certified eligible product, you know, not just for New Mexico, but for other states as well?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I mean, I think, you know, as long as basically your type of product can demonstrate energy savings in this case, I don't think there would be any reason why it probably couldn't be financed through CPACE. That's usually is more the hurdle and sort of the kind of requirement that you have to actually demonstrate in order for these projects to be considered to be financeable through CPACE. Normally, I've not seen really many programs in this case that require certain types of products or certain types of technologies have to be kind of quote unquote pre-qualified to be on sort of some form of a sort of pre-qualification list of any kind. I know normally most programs don't do something like that. So I think in this case that as long as that your technology can bear out and show that basically it does have a demonstrable energy savings component to it, then I don't think there would be any reason why then it couldn't be financed using CPACE.
And would this be, so basically the borrower would have to demonstrate this energy efficiency or savings, basically each borrower every time, or is there something we can do kind of to say, yes, we've been, we're demonstrating this energy efficiency and it has, let's say, worked for CPACE before?
Yeah, no, normally these projects are looked at on a kind of their own sort of individual merits, and that you couldn't necessarily, I think, just pre-qualify, a particular improvement because maybe a program's seen it before and it has some kind of form of demonstrable energy savings. Each project would have to go through and demonstrate, in this case, through an energy analysis of some kind, that it does bear out to show energy savings for those particular improvements. So it does basically have to go through that scrutiny each and every time before basically it could be considered for CPACE financing.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure thing. And then one other question that came through the chat, just want to acknowledge in this case, is that would say either EDD or us, the CPACE Alliance, have any future working groups to compile stakeholder recommendations on certainly the policy changes or the current legislation and guidelines? I think that would probably be a process that would be, I think, run by the EDD and any other sort of stakeholders within the state. So I certainly would say that that would probably be something that would be eventually in the court of Joanna's department in this case to dictate, what kind of maybe public comment period there could be, or any kind of other future sort of stakeholder engagement that would occur with building out the new guidelines in this case, should there be any future policy changes to the state statute.
So I would add, just in case there's sort of any corresponding concern, that while we did not engage in a large public comment session in preparing our recommendations to New Mexico EDD because of there was just a very, very short timeline under which we had to fulfill the contract for them, we did make sure to engage with Joanna and get a list from her, as well as from New Mexico's Environmental Resources Department. Apologies if I'm screwing up that department name, but from those two organizations, we did receive a list of stakeholders, EMNRD, thank you, in New Mexico, of general financial institutions, treasurers, contractors, sustainability advocates, etc. And we did engage in some targeted outreach just to make sure that different sections, cross sections of New Mexico's industry was represented and providing input to those policy recommendations as we developed them. So I do just want to confirm that we did not develop those in a vacuum.
Well, the good news actually is the gentleman who asked the question actually was part of our stakeholder conversations. I remember him well. And so bottom line is that, yeah, he just, I think, wanted to just curious to know if this was going to be a subsequent engagement with stakeholders in this case, that should there be a successful change of the statute with the recommendations we had made to EDD, and then the resulting program guidelines development that will have to occur for when basically those changes would be codified. As I've mentioned, I think I'm sure there will be some form of engagement process with stakeholders, whether it be through a public comments period or some other form of, again, stakeholder engagement process. I'm sure this is something that will be top of mind for Joanna and her team. All right, well, there are any other questions while we still have a few minutes? All right, well, so again, we thank you so much for joining us here this day. And just as a kind of reminder, these are contact information for us presenters who are on the conversation today, and as well as Joanna's own contact information as well going forward. And basically, what we'll do after this is that the EDD has promised to circulate the recording of this webinar to all of the participants who joined us here today. And you'll have the presentation and the contents of the webinar that we went through here this afternoon. And so, but of course, if probably any other questions, you have our contact information, and we certainly be very happy to entertain any further questions you may have. So, but other than that, thank you so much again for joining us today. And we're hopeful that we'll be able to have a CPACE program in this state very soon that will be functional, and that we'll be meeting certainly all your sustainability and resiliency needs. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.